We'll go ahead and get started here. Got 4 o'clock or maybe a moment after, so we'll get the ball rolling, and we certainly appreciate you being here this afternoon at such a late hour of the day, of a very busy day, I'm sure. Before I get started, I did want to give a quick shout out to Tracy Tolliver. She did a lot of heavy lifting on our presentation and actually submitted our presentation, and obviously it got accepted, but she couldn't be here at the last moment, so you'll have to contend with me for just a moment more. Very briefly, my name's John Feltz. I'm the head of technology and collections at Coastal Carolina University, and I have been at Coastal about 13 years and have been an academic librarian for just over 30. So again, thank you for your time this moment, and I'll let the other presenters introduce themselves as they come up rather than me butcher it for them. So. And also, I thought before we get into the specifics of the audit toolkit that I could perhaps set the table and explore why simple, user-friendly access is important to our users. Probably a lot of stuff you've already heard or know, but thought I'd go ahead and give that preamble first just to kind of get us in the spirit of this. So, first and foremost, of course, is our users' expectations. Most of our patrons these days grew up with the internet and being online is as natural to them as, well, waking up in the morning, whatever is natural. Yeah, okay, gotta work. Thank you. These are my talking points. And the majority of their online experiences occur on the consumer web, where they expect to be able to easily and quickly log in to access the information that they want. So they don't understand why it can't be the same for scholarly resources. And also, we know for a fact that a poor access experience not only is a detriment to our users' library experience, but it deters them from what we're trying to do writ large, and likely encourages them to use unsecure pirate sites like Sci-Hub, and it likely has implications on the usage data that librarians use when making purchasing decisions. So lastly, it increases support needs. So it's a support burden, as I'm sure any librarian in the audience can attest, and it takes a lot of time and people power to troubleshoot resource access issues. As an example, 3 of us in my shop, we used to field hundreds of support requests a year regarding access when we were using a proxy server. It was just confusing to our users why off-campus wasn't the same access experience as on-campus. But when my library migrated from IP-based access to federated access, using our kind of piggybacks on our SSO environment, our support requests were cut by 75%, which is significant. So what are some of the challenges of staying on top of access? Again, everyone in this room understands that access matters, and we also know that maintaining access is difficult. And there are numerous complicating factors, including the tech, of course. There are multiple technologies for access. IP addresses, VPNs, proxy servers, referring URLs, SIP2 protocol, federated authentication, and then now seamless access and IDP as a discovery that sits on top of SAML. Also consider the regulatory environment. It's complicated and the laws change frequently, and there's data privacy laws to consider, the GDPR, of course, and the CCPA in California, and they changed the way browsers, there's also changes in the way that browsers handle privacy as well that are forthcoming. I'll mention just in a moment, further on in my part of the presentation. But there's numerous other complications, such as vendors are frequently changing the look and feel and the overall functionality of their platforms, and we do not always know when these changes are occurring, or we're just simply lose sight of it because we're so overwhelmed and we don't have the bandwidth to keep track of that and do everything else that's more pressing. And, these may not individually seem like, particularly daunting situations, but at scale, it's frequently overwhelming, especially my brethren in electronic resources and the whole tech side of the house. So at Coastal Carolina University, we have hundreds upon hundreds of subscriptions to journals and ebooks, databases, streaming media, And especially when my renewal calendar hits July and January, we'll spend weeks upon weeks just fetching and analyzing data, interfacing with librarians, faculty, and administrators about these. And that's not even considering if we're actually considering unsubscribing to one, then batten down the hatches because you got to go through this whole process and get a lot of feedback, typically negative from faculty, and you have to kind of press forward with these considerations. And really, when you consider all of those at scale, the last thing on our minds is really the usability and the online privacy considerations of each of these sites. So therefore, and hence this talk, we introduced the concept of an Access Audit Toolkit, and I'll let Tim and Jason share with you in more detail about some of these concepts.
Okie dokie. Hey, everyone. So what is the Access Audit Toolkit, and why are you all sitting there hopefully thinking this could be useful for us? So we're all members of a collaborative cross-industry project called SeamlessAccess. And SeamlessAccess sits at the crossroads of many of these challenges, which is why we're proposing this as a solution to try and address all the issues we see across our industry with the access experience. So, firstly, the Access Audit Toolkit is designed as a framework. So it's a framework to assess the quality of your access experience. This initial version we're proposing today focuses on two particular aspects of that user experience, usability and privacy, and we'll be talking about those in a little bit more detail. And while this material already exists in various places around the internet, the toolkit brings it together, aligned around the issue of the user access experience. And one of the reasons we're doing this is because in our experience of talking to many people about access issues, it's really hard to try and get people's attention or to be able to put the focus into thinking about what goes into a good access experience. So the idea behind this toolkit is a simple framework that you can use to assess whether the vendors, typically, who are delivering your access experience are doing a good job. Secondly, it provides recommendations. So recommendations on best practices, industry standards, and other advice on how to deliver a more effective access experience to your library users. The aim is here to make it easy for you as librarians to firstly understand what those industry best practices are, and secondly, have a clear pace to point deficient vendors towards when they fall short. Third, it's a communications tool. So we want to improve knowledge and awareness of these issues outside of just the few people within your libraries who may actually spend a large portion of their lives devoted to looking at these issues. And so a lot of the communication within the toolkit is designed to be easily accessible. It's not techno jargon. It's sort of knee-deep, waist-deep, ankle-deep. And this communication is not just within the library, but also with other key stakeholders in your organizations that sit outside the library, but get to make decisions on resourcing and budgeting that could affect your ability to change the access experience. And then finally, we hope this toolkit can help libraries make a business case for investing in improving your access experience by highlighting the gaps between the current experience and best practice and identifying the specific improvements needed. Whether that investment is staff time to contact vendors and chase them to improve their delivery, or maybe working on improving internal policies, it takes some investment, and we want to help you to make that case, rather. The other thing to mention is that this is a new proposal. It is a working process. We don't have a nicely printed book with the toolkit in place. So an explicit reason we're here is really to propose this idea, walk through some of the aspects of it. We've tested it ourselves. We've got some feedback, and we would really like your input. And so we're going to be asking you at the Q&A towards the end. We're going to discuss the usability and privacy recommendations next, and then we're going to wrap up with John talking about some practical advice from librarians who've had a go at implementing it in practice. So usability first. So this is basically how usable is the access experience for your users. And we're going to break this down into 3 categories and provide examples of the questions that help you audit the usability of a service provider's interface. And the context here is a user landing cold at a service provider website, as opposed to working through your own library's discovery and resource pages. So first up, how obvious is it that a user is or rather, is it obvious how a user accesses a paywalled resource? So the simple way that usability experts test for this is the 5-second rule. Can a new user figure out what to click on to get access within 5 seconds of looking at a new web page? So service providers should really have one clear option to access the content. They should avoid presenting users with several equally important options. The interface should focus on addressing the majority of use cases, and it should avoid shifting the burden to the user to figure out where to click. And above all, access is a function that should be usable. It should not be a marketing opportunity to throw up all the other ways in which you can pay for access. So we've identified 3 specific questions in this area. So the first one is the primary access option clearly distinguished from other options. So in many cases, the primary access option may be just through your institutional subscription. Is it clear that that's the way you should do it, as opposed to a small number of people who may want to buy it as a download? And so this could be done through different and more prominent styling, for example. So is that primary option clearly distinguished? Secondly, do the options clearly communicate intent? So when you click on something, is it clear that that is a purchase that you're going to be making, as opposed to accessing through your institutional access? And another one is that there should really be a maximum of 3 alternate options. And if there are additional options, those should be progressively disclosed rather than just throwing them all up front. Second, selecting your organizational affiliation. So again, we're talking about the context of libraries. A lot of your users are going to be accessing through an institutional subscription to do that. Or rather, they won't have to do that if they're IP authenticated, but many other types of institutional credentials will require your users to identify their organizational affiliation. So that could be federated authentication, it could be public library cards, it could be other forms of SAML-based login. And historically, this has been a real pain for users. Every website offered a different approach to selecting your institution, different visual layouts, described the options using a wide variety of language, including technology descriptions like shibboleth that mean little to your users. So users need to be aware of the authentication level required. Is it I'm assigning as an individual or through some institutional credentials? And also, what additional resources are available once they're authorized? This should all be clear. So we've identified 4 questions in this category. Does the list show all institutions and doesn't hide institutions? Because one of the things we've found from user testing is that when you can't find your institution there, it's really confusing. Your institution should be there. Even if you then find that actually that's not going to give you access, that should give you an error or a message to explain why. But just hiding institutions completely, that's really confusing for users. Secondly, does the list indicate if an institution may not provide access? So that's the corollary of that. List the institution, but then make it clear visually that actually you won't be able to get access to this resource through that institutional affiliation. Can a user quickly filter the complete institutional list? So they could just start typing the name of the institution and boom, there it comes straight up. And lastly, can my institutional affiliation be remembered? And for those of you who are familiar with SeamlessAccess, that's the idea that when you select your institution at one publisher site, it can be remembered so that for future publisher sites, it will just present, do you want to log in as with the name of your institution, so you don't have to select it from the list every single time. The third usability requirement is, unsurprisingly, accessibility. So according to statistics from the US Centers for Disease Control, over 20% of your users will have at least one disability that can impair their ability to navigate web pages. Many government regulations require websites to be compliant with accessibility standards. So Section 508 of the US Rehabilitation Act, as an example, that requires federal agencies to provide individuals with disabilities equal access to electronic information and data comparable to those who do not have disabilities. But on the whole, we do a pretty dismal job of this. Many websites fail to comply, many claim to comply, but few are truly accessible. So here's a really interesting statistic I found. So there's an annual study of the top 1 million sites on the internet done by a web accessibility nonprofit based at the Institute for Disability Research, Policy and Practice at Utah State. They found that 96.8% of homepages had detectable WCAG2 failures. This is 96.8% of the top million sites on the internet. And if you're not familiar with the term, WCAG stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It's a series of standards developed by the Web Accessibility Initiative, which is part of the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C. So WCAG2, that's the current standard. And many of you, I suspect, are already looking for that standard or have mandates or policies internally to apply that. The reality is, lots of people claim it, few actually have it. Accessibility is also not just technical compliance, it's about having considerate interfaces. This is not a box we're trying to tick. The goal is to make it easier for people to access. So we've got 5 questions in this area. Can users navigate the access interface using their keyboard? Is there appropriate contrast? Can the content be easily magnified? Is it screen reader friendly, including institutional selections? So that enables users with assistive technology to find and select their institution, where all the visual cues are also announced verbally and additional guidance is provided. Because a lot of websites will make their content pages accessible and forget completely about the access experience. And if you can't navigate a website properly and trying to select institutions from a list, it's awful. And there's no reason it should be awful. And lastly, does it support non-English languages? Lastly, so what we're doing to help here is the idea behind the toolkit is there's a series of questions that you can ask to assess whether your vendors are providing a good access experience, and then there's reference resources that you can go for more information. So we've created dedicated resources to do this that are aimed at librarians. Each of these 3 web pages, and the slides have these links in, and the slides are available through the app, so you should be able to access them all. Take you to landing pages for more information. There's a couple of screenshots there. These are really usable, accessible pages. And again, they're designed to be read by you. They are giving examples of good and bad practice, and then they also do at the bottom is provide links to more detailed technical information. Now, the detailed technical information isn't really aimed at you. That's so that when you go to a vendor and say, you did a poor job of this, but good news, here's where you go to fix it. And these are the links to help you help them do a better job. And that's it. Thank you. Now, Jason.
Hello, everyone. So I'm Jason Griffey. I am the Director of Strategic Initiatives at NISO and also a member of the SeamlessAccess project in a variety of roles. I am here to talk today about the second aspect of the audit structure that we put together, which is privacy. Obviously, privacy is an incredibly central portion of access and authentication, especially to libraries and librarians. The sort of foundational principles that we had in mind when we were trying to think through how to approach this from an access and authentication standpoint. We went right back to the ALA Library Bill of Rights, right? All people, regardless of origin, age, background, or views, possess a right to privacy and confidentiality in their library use. Very straightforward. And secondarily, it is the responsibility of the library to understand how that patron data, any patron data is used, collected, shared, stored, et cetera. And so we came up with, again, 3 sort of areas that we think libraries should pay particular attention to as it regards access, authentication, and patron privacy. So the first of these is what patron data is shared automatically without patron knowledge, right? So there's a number of instances where authentication occurs. There is some data sharing between the university, your IDP, your library system, et cetera, and the vendor in question, the publisher in question. Something is shared. Is that what patron data is transferred that the patron does not know about, right? What specific pieces are shared, how much of it is personally identifiable, and how much of it is anonymous information that is not tied to a specific user. How is the data on the vendor side then stored? Is any of that data shared with third parties through an advertising network or some other secondary web-based methodology while the authentication is happening? And then are any stored patron credentials secure in the storage? So this is sort of focused on what happens sort of automatically behind the scenes. There are also plenty of instances where an authentication happens, access is granted in a situation where the patron is asked for something. So you may have a situation where some customizability is available on the vendor side, right? And the patron is asked to provide some set of information that allows them to re-log in and see a reading list or any number of things, right? So questions related to that sort of interaction How is that authentication, right? That may be actually separate, entirely separate from an authentication that verifies that the patron is a member of your organization. It may be an entirely separate set of information. How is that dealt with? Is it a requirement, or is it secondary to the patron's interaction with the information in question? What is it they're providing? Are they providing reading lists and reading habit information to your patrons? If so, is that data stored securely? How is that data being dealt with? How is the permission gained to store patron information? Are they asking affirmatively? Do they insist upon it? Do they have an opt-out? Is there an anonymous method for them to access the same sort of functionality? And then finally, can patrons delete their data if they want to opt out entirely from this interaction? So if they have chosen to opt in some way, can they then rescind that permission later and delete their data? And then finally, that's sort of the externalities of privacy and patron information. Internally to your library, how is data collected regarding patrons, right? Which of your systems collect patron data? Internally, when you're transferring information from the ILS to a proxy server to a learning management system to an ILL server to a whatever, right? All of our little interconnected systems behind the scenes. Does that have PII attached to it, or can you do that anonymously or pseudonymously? Do patrons opt in to that sort of data sharing behind the scenes in any way? How are those credentials stored internally on your own systems, right? And then from a metrics standpoint, the data that is collected by you or a learning management system or other systems that are attached to this data, this patron data, how is that data used then to be analyzed? Is it analyzed in aggregate? Is it analyzed individually? Is it analyzed, again, at a university at the school or major level? How are those sort of privacy issues dealt with? So those were sort of the big ideas as far as the organizational principle for the privacy aspect of the toolkit that we're developing. What is it that is collected automatically? What is it that is collected that patrons can opt into? And then what is it that's collected internally to the library? So sort of two externals and an internal. Now, none of this is new. Again, there's a lot of privacy audit resources out there. There's a lot of them that are focused on patron privacy. There's a lot of them that are focused on vendor relationships and legal agreements between libraries and vendors that rely on privacy. What we're trying to do is really sort of narrow everything down to the access and authentication aspect of the relationship, right? So this is an ALA resource, Privacy Audit Resources from the American Library Association. We've drawn some of our inspiration from this. This is a resource from the Library Freedom Project. They have an entire vendor privacy audit. If you're not familiar with it, it's an excellent piece. We've drawn a little bit of our inspiration from this. And then there's a handful of others, including the Prioritizing Privacy Project, which is an entire curricula dedicated to understanding privacy and understanding how data privacy is important in our space. So we're trying to sort of distill a lot of various resources down into something that is very focused on just access and authentication. So hopefully that will be useful. And I'm going to hand this off again, back to John.
All right, so I'm not going to give you whiplash by when I started our presentation, talking about how busy we are and how we just don't have time to consider these issues, and then immediately pivot and say, oh, it's a breeze, just do what we just said and everything's honky-dory. But there are some considerations in that. And, when we talk about using the toolkit, specifically when considering the usability and privacy preserving practices of a vendor's online platform, I found that I derived the most benefit as I walked through some of these questions on about a half a dozen different vendors and publisher sites. I found that if I perform the research as a majority of researchers do and start my path from the open web, that was invaluable in understanding the authentication issues around that. So In this way, authentication is not assumed to have already occurred, but is instead established at the point of need. And of course, I do that by emulating off-campus access. And then I found just by focusing on one vendor's platform at a time, and then focusing on one key aspect therein as being audited using this toolkit, it was more manageable. And I'll extrapolate on that just a little bit more. But first, lots and lots of information is already out there about website usability and testing. But when specifically assessing the usability of a publisher's site, I think that functionality and look and feel for easily accessing information is at the heart of the matter. And this primarily involves the authentication process. So when auditing vendors and publisher sites, I find that there's no consistency from site to site, and I'm met with varying degrees of complexity, jargon, and terminology that is confusing to users. Specifically and within the context of authentication, I found that, and I guess shameless plug, I found that in a nutshell, when seamless access was enabled by the vendors and publishers, that it greatly simplified authentication by providing a consistent and easily recognizable link to institutional access. However, without seamless access, you encountered a mixed bag. And again, it was difficult to figure out the appropriate link to click on to get access. It was difficult to locate. I mean, where was it on the vendor's landing page? I couldn't find it many times, or sometimes it was down below the citation and abstract, so you had to scroll down below it to find the access point. And I found also that, perhaps not unsurprisingly, many sites make the pay option more prominent than the institutional access option. I can't figure out why they would do such a thing. So when considering affiliation, I encounter basically the same issues. If a vendor has enabled seamless access, then the IDP discovery flow, which is fancy jargon for basically saying when you type in the institution with whom you're affiliated and it auto-completes, seamless access made that very consistent and user-friendly. Again, you just type it in and away you go. It auto-completes, you see your affiliation and you click on it. But if seamless access hasn't been implemented, then you run into very different experiences for identifying the institution for which you're affiliated. And I guess I'll just point out one thing that sort of annoyed me the most in many of these sites was seeing so many vendors having a menu that says, select your federation, or a link labeled with sign in with your Open Athens account. Like the majority of users even know what that stuff means, I think we're making a huge supposition there. But when considering accessibility, lastly, I'll just briefly say that overall I was very pleased, and I found that vendors take accessibility very seriously. And they put a great deal of effort in providing documentation and FAQs and typically some robust functionality around that. So when considering privacy, which is what Jason just discussed, I mean, it's a little bit more difficult to assess because the information isn't readily available to us. We're largely at the mercy of the vendors and publishers to protect our privacy and handle our personally identifying information in the manner in which they say they will. But I did find that there's typically a lot of privacy policies and ample documentation shared on vendor sites regarding their use and storage of PII. However, one thing did jump out at me when I started digging in some. I found that in the various vendors' terms of use, when I dug in there, many use third-party data and text analytics tools whose policies many times were quite different from the publisher's policies around personally identifying information. I have examples, but I'll share those after the presentation if you're interested. Specific to authentication, when we regard privacy considerations, I had a couple of observations, and typically most vendors don't require any PII to be stored to access their sites. But the problem with that is that the user doesn't, if they don't set up a personal account, which does share PII, then they aren't able to personalize their experiences, which means that they can't store articles and citations and the like. So you have that kind of ingrained tension between the personalization experience of enabling a very user-friendly experience versus the opposite of that. So when we were overly privacy preserving, then there's very little personalization involved. So also one other considerations, I found that vendors are increasingly offering users the ability to opt in or opt out of sharing varying levels of information to access their sites. And I've been hearing and reading a lot that users are starting to suffer from what I've read is called consent fatigue, where we're increasingly confronted with these pop-ups that require us to do something, click on something to approve or decline some information to get to our destinations. And also with upcoming browser changes regarding the way that browsers will handle users' privacy, this is liable to increase. And I think, Jason, have you given that comment? Yeah, Jason will be given an excellent presentation on, no pressure now, an excellent presentation on upcoming browser changes and the way they will affect the user experience. Okay, so what does all this mean? A lot of words we just discussed and shared with you, and believe me, I understand the immediate concerns. I look at you through the same eyes you probably look at me as librarians. Who has time to do this, right? Why should we do this? I mean, what's the value proposition or the cost-benefit consideration in taking on yet another chore when we have so much else to do? And believe me, I hear you, because I've worn the same hats you do, or in the past, or I currently do. But I did find that this was very doable from a time management standpoint. And rather than treating this as like a time-limited project and assigning personnel and resources to the task and getting it done in a hurry, I found that was something I could do when I'd completed some of my more time-sensitive tasks, like at the end of the day, when I was pretty tired and just didn't have the bandwidth to deal with other things. So I'd identify a vendor, I'd run through one or two of these questions and answer them as best that I could, click on a few links and what have you. And as I worked through these, certain patterns would emerge that I could then prioritize and take whatever actions were needed. Also, I found that many of these questions were ones that I'd intuitively ask myself when setting up a new resource. The decision was made to subscribe to it or to trial it, to consider a subscription to it as a new resource. So I'd kind of go through these questions in my head. So when considering this approach, it's both a retrospective and an ongoing look at the entirety of your resources, including ones that have been around a while. And lastly, by having them in a consistent format, I found that it offered a way to consistently document the many questions I'd ask when looking at a new resource in a more consistent, formulaic way. It would allow me to easily compare and contrast vendors and publisher sites. And then I had some immediate benefits that I could consider. I could leverage this information to make suggestions and negotiate with vendors. The library could conceivably utilize this information collected in the audit for publishing perhaps an advocacy report or privacy statement if you haven't already done so. And it could serve as a valuable teaching and training aid as well in helping users understand the value of their online identity. And we're seeing this especially as a growing need with our Gen Z population, who, having been born and completely enculturated with the online experience, they're surprisingly unaware of the issues surrounding online user privacy and security. So that sort of wraps up our formal part of our presentation. So I would kind of turn the tables and ask you, what do you think? I mean, we've talked about some of the tools, but we don't necessarily have a formal kit as of yet. So could you envision that some of the benefits of undertaking these types of tasks, would they be helpful to you? Would it be beneficial if this was packaged in a more digestible manner? Perhaps in some sort of website with forms that can be completed, or even downloadable forms that you could maintain on your desktops.